Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. We are witnessing a historic shift in global power dynamics, one that few anticipated and even fewer are prepared to confront. At the center of this dramatic transformation is a man whose name is quickly becoming synonymous with a new era of African assertiveness on the world stage, Ibrahim Traoré. While many Western powers continue to view Africa through a lens of dependency and intervention, Traoré has charted a different path, one defined by sovereignty, unity, and bold geopolitical strategy. Under his leadership, several African nations have moved decisively away from Western influence and turned toward emerging global powers, most notably Russia and China. The United States, once seen as the unrivaled force shaping international alliances, now finds itself sidelined in a region it long considered within its sphere of influence. This isn't merely a symbolic shift, it's a diplomatic and strategic realignment that exposes the cracks in U.S. foreign policy, cracks that have grown wider due to decades of inconsistent engagement, military overreach, and a failure to respect Africa's aspirations for self-determination. Traoré's message has been simple but powerful. Africa will no longer be anyone's pawn. By forging closer ties with Russia and China, he is challenging a status quo that has left much of the continent mired in underdevelopment and dependence. These partnerships promise investment without lectures, cooperation without condescension, and support without strings attached. The humiliation for the U.S. doesn't come from military defeat or economic collapse. It comes from irrelevance, from watching old alliances dissolve and new ones emerge, led by leaders who are unapologetically African in their worldview and unapologetically independent in their choices. What we are witnessing is more than a geopolitical shift. It's a rebirth. Africa is rising not as a subject of global power, but as a player in its own right. And Ibrahim Traoré is at the helm of this awakening, demonstrating that leadership rooted in pride, dignity, and vision can change the course of history. The lesson here is not just for America, but for the entire West. The time of dictating terms to Africa is over. The time of partnership and mutual respect must begin, because the world is watching and Africa is no longer waiting. Thank you. Ibrahim Traoré is leading a new wave of African sovereignty, breaking from Western influence and asserting a bold, independent foreign policy direction. His leadership reflects a growing sentiment across the African continent, one rooted in frustration with decades of external interference and a desire to shape Africa's future on its own terms. Traoré, the transitional president of Burkina Faso, has quickly become a symbolic figure for this new African awakening. Unlike leaders who have traditionally relied on Western support to sustain their regimes, Traoré has taken a different path, one that is unapologetically Pan-African, anti-imperialist, and grounded in national dignity. In recent years, many African nations have grown disillusioned with the promises of Western powers. Despite decades of aid and intervention, much of the continent continues to struggle with poverty, insecurity, and economic underdevelopment. The Western model, often packaged with conditions, moral lectures, and heavy-handed political influence, has failed to deliver lasting benefits for ordinary Africans. Traoré's rise to power came during a period of great instability in the Sahel region, with Burkina Faso grappling with terrorism, corruption, and a collapse of public trust in traditional political elites. But rather than turning to France or the United States for salvation, Traoré has looked eastward, forging deeper ties with Russia and China. This shift in foreign alignment is not merely a tactical move, it represents a profound change in worldview. Under Traoré, Burkina Faso and its allies in the region are asserting that Africa can no longer be treated as a subordinate in the international order. Instead, they seek to build partnerships based on mutual respect and non-interference. Russia and China, despite their own geopolitical ambitions, are seen by many African leaders as more respectful of national sovereignty and more willing to engage without imposing ideological frameworks. In this context, Traoré's outreach to Moscow and Beijing is a declaration that Africa is open to alternatives and will no longer tolerate paternalistic relationships. What makes this development even more significant is the growing support it receives among the population. Across Burkina Faso and neighboring countries, citizens have taken to the streets not in protest of these new alliances, but in support of them. Africa's strategic pivot to Russia and China reflects growing dissatisfaction with US and Western policies that often come with conditions and condescension. This shift is not sudden or accidental. It is the product of years of mounting frustration across the continent with a system of engagement that has, for many, failed to deliver genuine progress. While Western governments often present themselves as champions of development, democracy, and human rights in Africa, their actions have frequently told a different story, one of control, interference, and the preservation of strategic interests over the well-being of African nations. Many African leaders and citizens alike have grown weary of Western aid models that impose economic and political reforms as prerequisites for assistance. These conditions often undermine national sovereignty and limit a country's ability to determine its own path. Structural adjustment programs, trade agreements skewed in favor of Western corporations, and policies tied to loans from institutions like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank have all contributed to a deep skepticism of the West's role in Africa. These policies, while presented as steps toward modernization and prosperity, have often led to austerity, social unrest, and a loss of public trust in both governments and their foreign partners. In contrast, Russia and China have emerged as alternative allies, offering support without moralizing lectures or the kinds of political strings typically attached to Western aid. China's model in particular has gained traction through large-scale infrastructure projects, long-term investment, and loans that are not tied to governance reforms. From railways in Kenya to ports in Djibouti to hospitals and highways across dozens of countries, China has made its presence felt by delivering tangible results. While critics raise valid concerns about debt dependency and transparency, many African governments view Chinese involvement as more respectful of their agency and more effective in meeting immediate development needs. Russia, too, has expanded its influence in recent years, particularly in the realm of military cooperation and security. In countries like Mali, the Central African Republic, and Burkina Faso, Russian support has come in the form of military advisors, equipment, and training. These relationships have strengthened, in part because African governments are increasingly skeptical of Western-led military interventions, which are often seen as ineffective or self-serving. The US and France in particular have faced backlash for their roles in counterterrorism operations that, while extensive and costly, have failed to bring long-term stability to the Sahel and other regions. Against this backdrop, Russia is seen as a pragmatic partner that does not interfere in domestic politics and is willing to support regimes that the West seeks to isolate or replace. This reorientation toward Russia and China is as much about identity and pride as it is about strategy. For decades, Africa has been portrayed in global narratives as dependent, vulnerable, and in need of saving. Western powers, through their media, diplomacy, and institutions, have reinforced this image, often dictating what development should look like and who gets to lead it. The growing partnerships with Russia and China, however, are allowing African leaders to reject these narratives and assert a new vision, one where Africa is not a recipient of charity, but a participant in global power shifts. The West's condescending approach has also alienated many young Africans, who make up the majority of the population. They see the hypocrisy in Western governments promoting democracy abroad while supporting authoritarian regimes that align with their interests. They see how wealth extracted from African resources benefits corporations and foreign investors more than local communities. They see the endless conferences and development summits that result in lofty declarations but little meaningful change. In this context, alliances with non-Western powers represent not just an economic or political choice, but a statement of resistance and self-respect. Moreover, the global balance of power is changing. As the influence of Western powers wanes and new centers of power emerge in the East, African countries are repositioning themselves to take advantage of these shifts. They are no longer content to be junior partners or bystanders. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré understand that Africa must diversify its alliances to truly become independent. By engaging with Russia and China, they are not necessarily rejecting the West outright, but demanding a more balanced, equitable relationship, one that acknowledges Africa's right to chart its own course. The US is losing relevance in Africa, not through conflict, but through diplomatic failure and a lack of genuine partnership and respect for African self-determination. This decline is not the result of a sudden rupture or a specific event, but rather a slow erosion of trust and influence that has built up over years. African nations, once seen as loyal partners in U.S. foreign policy frameworks, are now openly questioning the value of their relationships with Washington. The rhetoric of partnership that the United States continues to promote increasingly rings hollow when measured against its actions and priorities on the continent. One of the core problems lies in the way the U.S. approaches diplomacy with Africa. There is often a clear imbalance in how African leaders are engaged compared to those from other regions. African issues are frequently treated as peripheral to American interests, addressed more out of obligation than strategic respect. High-level visits are rare, U.S. embassies often lack deep local engagement, and initiatives announced with fanfare tend to fade away without significant follow-through. When the U.S. does engage, it tends to emphasize security and counterterrorism, often overshadowing the broader needs of development, infrastructure, and economic partnership that many African countries prioritize. In contrast, powers like China and Russia have adopted a more sustained and focused approach. China has embedded itself in nearly every corner of the African continent through major infrastructure projects, consistent political engagement, and large-scale investments in education, healthcare, and digital technology. Russia, while operating on a smaller economic scale, has built strong ties through military partnerships and by supporting African states in international forums. These countries are seen as treating African governments with a degree of respect and equality that the U.S. has often failed to provide. As a result, their influence has grown, not because of ideological alignment, but because of practical and consistent engagement that meets African interests. The U.S. foreign policy approach to Africa still reflects a legacy of paternalism and suspicion. Policies are often tied to conditionalities, such as demands for governance reforms, human rights improvements, or alignment with U.S. positions on global issues. While these values are important, the manner in which they are enforced can appear patronizing and hypocritical. Many African nations see these demands as a form of control, especially when the U.S. continues to support authoritarian allies in other parts of the world when it suits its interests. This double standard undermines Washington's credibility and fuels resentment, particularly among younger generations of Africans who are politically aware and increasingly vocal. Additionally, the U.S. often fails to understand the regional complexities and domestic dynamics within African states. Its policies are shaped by outdated assumptions or one-size-fits-all strategies that ignore local contexts. The lack of African voices in shaping these policies is a significant part of the problem. African leaders and thinkers are rarely given a platform in American discourse, and their perspectives are often sidelined in favor of Western analysts and institutions. This creates an environment where African concerns are misunderstood or oversimplified, further deepening the divide. Moreover, when African nations act independently or pursue policies that do not align with U.S. interests, they are often met with criticism, sanctions, or diplomatic cold shoulders. This reaction reinforces the perception that the U.S. only respects African countries when they conform to its expectations. Such an approach does not encourage genuine partnership. It discourages autonomy. Leaders who advocate for a more assertive and independent African voice on the global stage, such as Ibrahim Traoré, are often vilified in Western media, while their popularity among African populations is ignored or dismissed. What the U.S. seems to have missed is that Africa is changing rapidly. Its youth population is growing, its economies are diversifying, and its leaders are becoming more confident in pursuing alternative alliances. The continent is no longer looking to be lectured or managed. It is looking for cooperation that respects its sovereignty and ambitions. The language of development assistance and democracy promotion is not enough if it is not backed by mutual respect and tangible benefits. African nations are making it clear that they want to engage with the world as equals, not as dependents. Russia and China offer Africa alternative alliances, providing investment and cooperation without the ideological pressure historically exerted by the West. This change is altering the global balance of power and reshaping how African nations interact with the rest of the world. For decades, African countries have had to navigate partnerships with Western powers that came with strings attached. financial aid and development assistance were often contingent upon adopting certain political or economic models, liberal democracy, market reforms, and compliance with international institutions that were heavily influenced by Western interests. While many of these policies were well-intentioned, they frequently overlooked local contexts, traditions, and political realities. The result was a strained relationship where African nations were often treated more like subjects than sovereign equals. China and Russia, by contrast, present themselves as partners that prioritize respect for national sovereignty and mutual benefit. China's presence in Africa has grown dramatically over the past 2 decades. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has built railways, ports, highways, power stations, and digital infrastructure across the continent. These projects, while criticized by some for lacking transparency or potentially creating debt dependency, have delivered visible and functional infrastructure in countries long neglected by Western development agendas. China rarely demands political reform in exchange for its investment. Instead, it emphasizes economic cooperation, trade, and state-to-state partnerships. This approach resonates with many African leaders who are seeking development without the perceived interference in their domestic affairs. Russia's approach, though less economically expansive than China's, is equally significant in political and security terms. Russia has stepped in where Western powers have withdrawn or been pushed out, particularly in countries that have experienced political instability or conflict. Through security cooperation, arms deals, and military training, Russia has positioned itself as a reliable partner willing to support African regimes regardless of their ideological alignment. In places like Mali, the Central African Republic, and Burkina Faso, Russian support is viewed as a form of solidarity against what many see as neo-colonial pressure from the West. This has been especially true in countries that have rejected Western military presence and sought new avenues for asserting their sovereignty. The appeal of these new alliances goes beyond immediate economic or security benefits. They offer African nations a sense of autonomy in a global order that has often sidelined them. China and Russia do not insist on regime change, democratic benchmarks, or market liberalization as preconditions for cooperation. For leaders trying to manage complex internal dynamics, such conditions can feel like external intrusions. By removing these ideological requirements, China and Russia allow African governments to pursue their own political paths without fear of punishment or diplomatic isolation. This model has become increasingly attractive in a multipolar world. African nations are no longer forced to choose between aligning with the West or facing isolation. They now have the leverage to negotiate better terms, to diversify their alliances, and to engage in what some call non-alignment 2.0, a modern version of balancing global powers to serve national interests. The presence of China and Russia has opened up diplomatic space, enabling African countries to assert their agency more confidently and to avoid the dependency that came with one-sided Western relationships. At the same time, many Africans view these new partnerships through a pragmatic lens. The interest in China and Russia is not necessarily ideological. Most African governments and citizens are not trading one power bloc for another out of loyalty or belief. Instead, they are looking for what works. They want roads that get built, power grids that function, weapons that secure their borders, and investment that brings jobs. If those come from Beijing or Moscow rather than Washington or Brussels, then so be it. The issue is not who the partner is, but what kind of partnership they offer. However, this does not mean African nations are blind to the potential risks. Concerns about Chinese debt, land deals, and labor practices persist. There are also questions about the long-term impact of relying on Russian military support in politically fragile states. Yet, despite these issues, many African leaders prefer to navigate those challenges on their own terms rather than accept externally imposed governance structures or development models. Traore symbolizes a broader African awakening, representing leaders who prioritize African interests, unity, and a rejection of neo-colonial influence. His rise to prominence is not just the story of a single leader taking charge in a moment of national crisis. It is the story of a continent slowly but steadily redefining its role in the global order. In the eyes of many Africans, Traoré is not simply the transitional president of Burkina Faso. He is a voice for sovereignty, dignity, and resistance against decades of political manipulation and economic dependency. His leadership reflects a growing continental sentiment that Africa must look inward for strength and outward only on its own terms. For too long, African politics have been shaped by external forces. From colonial administrations to post-independence alignments with Western powers, the continent has been subject to economic models, governance systems, and development strategies that were often imposed or encouraged from the outside. These systems rarely considered the diversity of African cultures, histories, and local realities. Instead, they tended to replicate the interests of the powers that promoted them. The result has been a cycle of dependency where foreign aid replaces self-reliance and foreign interests often outweigh national priorities. Traoré represents a break from this cycle. His rhetoric and actions communicate a refusal to continue the status quo, and this resonates widely, especially among Africa's youth. What makes Traoré particularly compelling is that he does not operate alone. He is part of a growing group of African leaders who are beginning to challenge the idea that solutions to African problems must come from outside the continent. This new generation of leadership is more assertive, less apologetic, and increasingly focused on regional cooperation rather than dependence on Western nations. In countries like Mali, Niger, and Guinea, similar voices have emerged, emphasizing national dignity, anti-corruption, and a return to Pan-African ideals. These leaders may vary in their ideologies and approaches, but they share a common understanding. Africa must put its own interests first. Traoré's rejection of neo-colonial influence is not rooted in mere ideology. It is based on lived experience. Burkina Faso, like many countries in the Sahel, has been the recipient of years of Western military and development assistance, particularly from France. Yet the security situation has deteriorated. The economy has remained fragile, and trust in Western intentions has eroded. For many in the region, continued foreign presence has not translated into peace or progress. Instead, it has created a perception of occupation and control. Traoré's decision to expel French forces and turn to non-Western partners like Russia is not just a tactical move, it is a statement. It says Burkina Faso will not allow its sovereignty to be dictated by those who have failed to respect it. This message has found deep resonance across Africa, especially among younger generations who are increasingly politically active and conscious of their history. They see in Traoré a leader who speaks the language of independence, not just in theory, but in practice. He is unafraid to criticize the international order, challenge media narratives, and make bold decisions that assert African autonomy. While some in the West portray such leaders as populists or military strongmen, many Africans view them as patriots taking necessary steps to reclaim control over their nation's destinies. The movement that Traoré symbolizes is not without its challenges. Rejecting neo-colonialism does not automatically solve the complex issues of governance, development, and security that face many African countries. Moreover, new alliances with countries like Russia and China must be managed carefully to avoid simply replacing one form of dependency with another. But the difference now is that leaders like Traoré are making these choices themselves, rather than having them made for them by global powers or international institutions. That in itself is a revolutionary act in a world that has long denied Africa the right to choose freely. Unity is also a critical theme in Traoré's vision. He has spoken frequently about the need for African countries to work together, to form regional alliances, and to resist the divide and rule tactics that have historically weakened the continent. This echoes the early Pan-African ideals championed by leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Thomas Sankara. It is a call not only for national liberation, but for collective strength. In a global system where individual African states often struggle to assert influence, regional unity may be the key to economic and political transformation. This shift marks a global power realignment, where Africa is emerging as an active geopolitical player, not a passive recipient of foreign agendas. For decades, Africa has been treated as a continent to be influenced, managed, or developed according to the priorities of external actors. Whether through colonial rule, Cold War alliances, or post-colonial aid and trade relationships, African countries were more often on the receiving end of global decisions rather than contributors to them. Today, that narrative is changing. Africa is no longer waiting to be told what to do or whom to follow. It is stepping into a role that reflects its growing confidence, strategic importance, and the evolving priorities of a multipolar world. The emerging trend is clear. African nations are becoming more deliberate in choosing their partners and asserting their interests on the global stage. Rather than aligning exclusively with traditional Western powers, many African governments are diversifying their international relationships. They are engaging more actively with China, Russia, India, Turkey, and Gulf countries, creating a complex web of alliances based on pragmatism rather than ideology. This shift is not about rejecting the West entirely. It is about refusing to be bound by outdated expectations and one-sided partnerships. African leaders are making it clear that their countries will no longer be treated as pawns in someone else's game. One of the reasons Africa's geopolitical position is strengthening is its sheer strategic and economic value. The continent holds vast reserves of natural resources, including critical minerals like cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements that are vital to the global energy transition. It also has a rapidly growing population, projected to reach over 2 billion by 2050, with a massive youth demographic that represents both a labor force and a market for future economic expansion. These realities make Africa an indispensable player in global affairs. Any country or bloc that seeks to shape the future of trade, technology, climate policy, or security must now consider Africa's position and potential. The assertiveness of African countries in global forums reflects this growing leverage. In institutions like the United Nations, the African Union, and the BRICS Alliance, African leaders are demanding a greater voice in decision-making processes. They are calling for reforms in global governance structures that have long marginalized the continent, such as the UN Security Council and international financial institutions. African states are also increasingly coordinating their positions on trade, climate negotiations, and peacekeeping, signaling a readiness to act collectively when their interests are at stake. This is a far cry from the fragmented and externally driven diplomacy that characterized much of the post-independence era. At the heart of this transformation is a shift in mindset. Africa is no longer content with being labeled as a continent of problems to solve. It wants to be seen as a continent of opportunities to engage with, on its own terms. The younger generation, in particular, is driving this change. Connected through technology, educated in global affairs, and increasingly mobilized around political and social issues, African youth are challenging the status quo. They are demanding leadership that reflects their aspirations and rejects dependency narratives. They are also more aware than ever of the power dynamics that have shaped Africa's interactions with the rest of the world, and they are determined to rewrite those dynamics in favor of justice, dignity, and agency. This realignment is also visible in Africa's handling of global crises. Whether responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, negotiating climate agreements, or managing the effects of war and inflation, African governments are asserting their perspectives with greater clarity. They are less willing to accept unequal vaccine distribution, unfair climate financing terms, or economic policies that benefit global markets at the expense of African stability. The demand for fairness and equity is not new, but what is new is the unified and strategic way in which it is being expressed. However, the road ahead is not without challenges. Internal divisions, governance issues, and external pressures still threaten to undermine Africa's collective strength. Some African leaders continue to rely on short-term alliances that may serve political survival more than national interest. Corruption and poor institutional frameworks in some countries remain obstacles to meaningful sovereignty and international credibility. Yet, despite these setbacks, the broader trend is undeniable. The continent is shifting from a reactive posture to a proactive one, from dependency to engagement, from isolation to influence.